Oh God, Mary, I'm sorry. I didn't want...
God hates vanity. So do I. The outsider woman has this world's destruction in her womb. But Val and his apostates stole away the unborn enemy. The fiend's father has escaped. She will bear her filthy yield before dawn. We have only these few hours to find her and kill her and save this paradise from hell everlasting. Where is she? Where did Val...
Sullivan Knoth is perhaps the most wicked and vile person that Blake Langermann will encounter during the events of the game Outlast 2. A self-proclaimed prophet who has garnered quite the following, Knoth has entirely devoted himself to the belief that he is the chosen one. Chosen by the one true God to stop the plague that will be unleashed on this earth if the so-called enemy is allowed to be born. Knoth seemingly believes that he's truly been chosen by a higher power, and around that belief has created a church which he dubbed the Testament of the New Ezekiel, a cult that's attracted more than a few devoted followers.
Salvation. For God is great, and Knoth is his prophet, and Knoth will ransom us from the power of the grave. Knoth will redeem us from death, for even redemption cannot be hid from the split eye.
The story of Father Knoth as we know it begins in 1966, with a much younger Sullivan living in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and working as a shoe salesman. From what we know of Knoth's younger life, he was very much so struggling just to make ends meet. And one fateful night, as his home was on the verge of being taken from him and his financial woes were at an all-time high, he would tune in to a late-night evangelical radio station seeking comfort in the words of religion. Unfortunately, as Knoth listened to the radio preacher's sermon of the evils of extramarital fornication, he found no salvation. However, as the broadcast continued to play, Knoth began to notice small sounds of static beneath the radio preacher's words. And as he began to listen more intently, he made out these hidden messages to be the true voice of God. Through these static messages, God told Knoth that he was very displeased with the world and with its modern churches, that he needed a new prophet, someone to be his new voice, his earthly presence, and that Knoth was perfect for the role. Following his communion with God, Knoth walked out into the night, looking up at the sky and seeing a vision like that of the prophet Ezekiel. The vision was that of a terrible angel, a creature crowned in fire with many faces and surrounded by wheels within wheels. This vision told Knoth that the end of days would be coming in his lifetime, and that he would be the one to herd the chosen few into paradise, leaving the rest of the world to everlasting torment. With newfound purpose in his life, Sullivan Knoth would take to the streets of Albuquerque, preaching the words that God had supposedly told him through the static. And over time, he began to accrue quite the following, the passion in his words inspiring the lost and disaffected to his cause. Within the year, he'd amassed dozens of followers and had dubbed his new church the Testament of the New Ezekiel, the new members donating all of their earthly possessions to the cause and devoting their lives to the teachings of Sullivan Knoth. One wealthy member of the cult in particular, Linda Deegan, providing the Testament of the New Ezekiel refuge on her luxury ranch. It was here that Knoth would begin to record his own holy book, which he called the Gospel of Knoth, a book relaying the words of God that Sullivan continued to receive. It was also here that Knoth and his followers would have their first run-in with the law. To seemingly bolster the cult's ranks in the fight against the Antichrist, Knoth encouraged the female members of his flock to breed as frequently as possible, even providing his own seed to the cause. Knoth would deliver these children personally, despite lacking the appropriate qualifications to do so. And it would be these births that would give the New Mexico Police Department the legal authority to crack down on the cult. With a warrant for health and safety violations, police raided Deegan's luxury ranch, arresting a dozen cult members in the process and forcing Knoth to flee his safe haven with only a handful of devoted followers. This raid would cause serious problems for the testament of the new Ezekiel, and in his despair, Knoth would climb to the top of a mountain alone to commune with God. In this holy communion, God would tell Knoth that his vision was still blurred, that in order to see the true destiny for his church, he would need to sacrifice his eye in exchange for truer vision. And so, on top of the mountain, Knoth unsheathed his blade, slicing his left eye down the middle, and finally seeing the plans that God had for him. Through the blood and tears, Knoth saw the vision of a town deep within the wilderness, far from civilization and those who wished to harm his church. God told Knoth that this place would be his new temple, his gate, and in the wake of this communion, Knoth and his followers would set out to create this new paradise. And in 1971, their dream would become a reality.
Temple Gate, founded by Sullivan Knoth, the modern Ezekiel. Their knives sharp for the enemy.
In the new town of Templegate, Knoth and his followers would carve out an odd but sustainable life for themselves amongst the wilderness, living almost completely independently from normal civilization, only venturing into the damned world to retrieve things that they could not make, such as gasoline or electrical equipment. This isolation was perfect for Knoth, and allowed his sermons to completely consume the entire community. Knoth spoke to his followers of eternal paradise, told them that their lives were in service to the defeat of the enemy, but that once it was defeated, they would bask in God's everlasting heaven. He told them that the road would be difficult, but that it was God's will that they follow it. And so they did. Over the course of decades, Knoth conditioned Templegate for the apocalypse, enforcing his rule which was to be obeyed without question. He was the prophet of God after all. In his gospel, Knoth said that it was his duty to multiply, that of his children he would make a nation, and from within his own nation, the enemy would be born. However, despite their deep seclusion, there was still a force that impacted the small community of Templegate, and over time, that force would seemingly erode Knoth's already very fragile mind state. Knoth seemingly perceived this force to be from God, and as time went on, it began to encourage violent tendencies amongst the cultists and amongst Knoth.
Fuck was that?
Are we gonna have to
Oh no. Daddy.
put him
Daddy,
down?
help. Fire.
I don't want
Daddy. Please. Daddy, oh God.
As this force and its influence in Templegate grew, the conditions of Knoth's paradise would slowly diminish. A sickness would break out amongst the cult faithful, and they would create a splinter faction known as the Scald. Knoth would inform them that this sickness was born from their sins, and send them deeper into the woods so as not to infect the pure of the Testament. However, this sickness was no spiritual illness. The Scald were infested with sexually transmitted diseases, syphilis being the most prominent, with the person likely spreading this disease being none other than Father Knoth himself, the only cultist with the means to acquire the medicine needed to treat the ailment. Knoth also told the cultists that the Antichrist would be born from his nation, and so, when he believed the end times to be approaching, he began killing the children of his followers, seeing them as necessary sacrifices in the fight against the enemy, having followers such as Val do most of the dirty work. This didn't sit right with certain members of the cult, however, and another splinter would be created. This one led by Val, who broke away from Knoth's wishes and started a war between the two factions. All of this, not to even mention the supply shortages that were starving the Skald and the sexual assaults that Knoth would commit in accordance with his own earthly desires. One of these victims of Knoth's sexual misconduct was a young girl named Anna Lee, a 15-year-old girl who'd gotten pregnant after Knoth had taken a liking to her. And knowing that this pregnancy would be terminated should Knoth find out, she fled the cult of the Testament of the New Ezekiel, and would eventually become the Jane Doe that brought Blake and Lynn Langermann to these forsaken lands and into Knoth's twisted web.
I'm Lynn Langermann, here for NewsTomorrow.net. We're flying past the Havasupai Indian Reservation in central Arizona in search of the origins of murder victim
Hey,
Jane
Lynn,
Doe.
I don't think you should say murdered. We don't know that.
Oh, I'll say she strangled herself to death.
That's what the police report said.
During Blake's adventures in Templegate, Knoth will largely loom distantly in the shadows, manipulating his community behind the scenes and away from the cameraman's lens. When Knoth's men find Lynn at the helicopter crash site, they bring her back to the Prophet, who, after inspecting her, tells his followers that she is the mother of the enemy they have long waited to defeat. Lynn manages to escape the Prophet's captivity, however, causing Knoth to spend the rest of Blake's journey attempting to track down the child that God has tasked him with eradicating. Sullivan Knoth is an evil man. Perhaps not so much when he began his religious journey, but certainly when he ended it. Knoth truly believed himself to be God's chosen, and this belief in the words of God that he supposedly heard told him to do absolutely appalling things. Infanticide, rape, torture, murder, all in the name of an all-powerful deity that was greenlighting these atrocities. Knoth was God's herald, his new Ezekiel, his prophet, and even if God's voice had been corrupted without Knoth's knowledge, he never once questioned that he was truly doing God's work. To his dying breath, he believed himself to have lived his life with the purest faith a man could have.
God has gone silent. Since the storm, the birth. Who will he have if he destroys us all? Who will he have left to punish? I killed my children. All of them. Every last one. There's no more perfect faith than that. And still, God is silent. Kill that child if you can. If you love anything at all, crush its skull under your heel. I know God doesn't hear dead men, but I expect he answers them. Ah!